Hello, my name is Allison Hammond, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. If you prefer to write us a note, there will be a notepad and pens on a table as you exit the building. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Dr. Jim Wilbanks.
Thank you, Allison. Afternoon, all, and welcome to the sixth in a series of 10 lectures on selected World War II topics. Our speaker today is Dr. Janet Valentine. She has a PhD from the University of Alabama and extensive experience as a practicing historian as well as a teacher at various levels. But more than that, and I'm not going to read her bio to you because you can read it and I don't want to take the time away from her presentation. If you came to the Cold War series or you've been to any of these World War II series, you can thank Janet because she's the one that coordinated it and got the speaker lineups and put all the topics together. So today we get to hear her talk, but you can thank her for the whole series, this one and the previous one. Janet, without further ado.
Thanks for coming. I know that it's sometimes hard to make yourself come out on a hot summer's day, so that we have such a good attendance today, I appreciate it very much. The topic for today is women in World War II. And most of the time, what we hear about women in World War II is actually their experiences once they have been inducted into the service and trained and what it is they did. We don't talk very often about how it is that there came to be Women's Army Corps or the Waves or the Women Marines. And that's what I really want to talk about today because women are increasingly a part of the United States military. They have been much in the news of late for all sorts of reasons, reasons that are actually similar to some of the concerns that legislators and Army leaders had back in World War II when they were trying to decide how and even if they would incorporate women into the services. So I think that this is an apropos topic. I think it, even though we are talking about a historical event, I think that it has a lot that it can offer us in understanding what's going on at present. During the Great War, about 34,000 American women enlisted in the military. Now, that's not a lot when you compare it with how many women are in the service today. Women now comprise about 14 to 15% of the American military, and that's somewhere close to 300,000. So that's a much bigger number. But at the time, and in the context of the time, those women seemed pretty exotic. Very daring. They were doing something that a lot of women actually wanted to do but were afraid to do. And in fact, there were a number of Americans and a number of British citizens looking at their own women who had enlisted to help as maybe those women aren't really socially acceptable. Maybe those women are a little looser than my daughter, so I probably don't really want my daughter or my sister to enlist. But nevertheless, it was an exciting time, and the women who served in World War I were serving for much the same reason that any other soldier or sailor would volunteer. And that's simply because they were patriotic and they understood that their services were needed. Now, that doesn't mean they also weren't excited by the possibility of a little adventure. And this really was an adventure for a woman in the early 20th century. One of the interesting things about the women who served in that period is if you served for the Army, you served without military status. You volunteered. You would serve as a telephone operator, you could serve in a clerical position, but if you went to Europe, you went without military status. Now, it was different for the Navy. The Naval Reserve Act of 1916 had a clause in it that said any citizen could be enlisted in the Navy. And so the Navy interpreted that very literally, and they enlisted female citizens into the Navy in military status. And that is a significant difference. That makes a huge difference in the interwar period, because those women who served with the American Expeditionary Force, say as telephone operators or as clerical workers, many of those women became ill, were disabled during the interwar period, and were not eligible for benefits. There was no legal basis to give them those benefits. In fact, they weren't even covered by any civil service regulation. So if a woman got benefits who was not in the Navy, if she served in the Navy, that was not an issue, because remember, she's in military status if she serves with the Navy. But if she serves with the Army, if she serves for the Army, no military status, she had to petition Congress for benefits. And those were decided on a case-by-case basis. And that meant that some women got them and most women didn't. Sometimes they might be granted military medical care, but sometimes not. So there was a very uneven application of benefits for women who had served for the Army. Again, the Navy and the Marine Corps are different. The sea services are different. That poses a real conundrum in the interwar period, because the Army is sort of considering whether or not to create some kind of corps that they can call on, female corps that they can call on in case of a future war. And as you know, as time goes on, it becomes increasingly apparent that there is going to be a war and that the United States is not going to be able to stay out of it. But the question, the sticking point is whether or not those women will be given military status. Now, anyone who fully supports the idea of women serving in the armed forces absolutely believes that women should be given military status. They have seen all of the problems that it has caused, not just for these veterans, and they are veterans even though not legally, but they've seen not only the problems it causes for them, it causes all sorts of administrative problems as well throughout World War I. Because if they aren't in military status, then who's responsible for administration? Who can give them orders? Who's responsible for making sure they're dressed properly and representing the nation properly? And you know how women are. If they're not kept under close control, they're very likely to do something hugely embarrassing. And so there are all of these questions that remain. You know, they don't want these same issues. Now, the people who are most concerned about some of those bigger legal questions actually, frankly, tend to be women. The military itself, the Army in particular, sort of expects that it will need to create a corps of women, but they're very reluctant to do so as serving in the Army. They want to stick with that idea of women serving with the Army rather than in it. And part of that is tradition. Part of that is they really don't want to be bothered, because if they serve in the Army, then you have to worry about very practical things like uniforms. You have to worry about cost. You have to worry about rank, and we really don't want women carrying the same rank as men. You have to worry about things like separate toilet facilities. And that really is troubling to a lot of people because it's costly, it takes time, and you have to arrange it. So there are a lot of reasons why the Army in particular is resistant to setting up a women's corps serving in the Army in the interwar period. But the Army isn't the only actor that is reluctant in this time. The American people, as represented by Congress, and that is always questionable, how closely Congress mirrors the American people. But remember that clause I told you about in the 1916 Naval Reserve Act that said citizens could serve? Well, in 1925, Congress changed that to read male citizens could serve, so that the Navy could not act without Congress approval should there be another war. So that complicates it for the Navy. Navy had very intelligently, of course, just said, well, look, we can enlist them. Why do we have any problem with that? There are efforts, however, in the interwar period to create plans for a women's corps in the Army. There is a little-known position in the interwar period within the Army that was called the Director of Women's Relations. And the first person who held it got disgusted after a year and said, I'm out of here. You're going to have to find someone else to do this. The next person who took it was the daughter of an Army family. She was familiar with the Army. She was dedicated to this idea. Her name was Anita Phipps. Anybody ever heard of Anita Phipps? No, not many people have. So she stuck with this job for 10 years. She was really devoted to it. And she did a very careful and very in-depth study across the United States with all of the services. She talked to the Canadians, she talked to the Brits about their experience, about how to incorporate women into the service in time of war. And in her plan, she said very clearly what you have to do is the women have to serve in the Army as opposed to with the Army. And immediately there were all sorts of objections to Phipps' plan. And most of them were exactly the objections that I told you about previously. It was going to be too much money because you would have to build different kind of living arrangements. And again, toilet facilities would have to be either built or altered. And there's this issue of new uniforms and who's going to be responsible for that. And, you know, oh, by the way, what about this rank thing? And the rank really does have a lot to do with the resistance. But, and I think that is most clearly revealed in an objection that came from an assistant chief of staff by the name of Brigadier General Campbell King. On one of the notes that was attached to Phipps' study as it made its rounds again and again and again, trying to get approval from the various bureaus for the various parts of the plan, King wrote this note and attached it to Phipps's study. And he was concerned that the plan threatened to create a woman-dominated organization that would prove a, and I quote here, powerful machine, difficult to control, and endowed with possibilities of hampering and embarrassing the War Department. So the idea of creating a women's corps that served in the Army with women of rank wearing a uniform with insignia on it scared him to death. And he was not prepared to approve that. That was in 1926. In 1928, the Army appointed a major by the name of Everett Hughes as the chief Army planner for a women's corps. Now, remember that Phipps's study had been absolutely shelved as inappropriate, in large part because she had said women should serve in the Army. Now, Hughes wasn't thrilled about planning for women serving in time of war, but that was largely because he felt you couldn't know what you really needed until there was a war to be dealt with. So he felt as if maybe he wasn't given all the information that he needed to do a sufficient planning with. But he also came to the conclusion that if you're going to have women in service during time of war, that they should in fact serve in the Army and not with it. So he came up with the wrong conclusion as well. That's not the conclusion anybody was really looking for. His study was shelved indefinitely in 1931, and the note attached to this study, the death knell for this particular study, said, "May as well suspend as no one seems willing to do anything about it." So there were two very full studies that suggest, yes, you will need a women's corps, and it needs to be in the Army. That is the general consensus of anybody who studies this idea in any depth. But that's in 1931, and that's really the last time until the late 30s that the Army looks at this with anything other than, oh gosh, maybe we should study it. Finally, there is a third plan developed, and that is in 1939. George C. Marshall becomes Chief of Staff, and as you know, he has a good deal of foresight. He really does understand that the United States has to plan to go into World War II and plan as fully as possible. It is the plan that he requests that eventually provides the model for mobilizing women during World War II. Now, this study, however, was built around the idea that there would be, under no circumstances, women serving in the Army. They were to be serving with the Army as an auxiliary. Despite all of those problems that had surfaced in World War I, and despite the very real inequities that women veterans had faced in the interwar years, this is not what Marshall wants. He wants them to be an auxiliary. And ultimately, now these are people of their time, and so I do not mean to condemn them, but the reality is they don't want them to serve in the military, simply because they are women. And that's what it really has to do with. For the most part, they don't think that women should be in charge of anything. They don't want to risk a woman having a position where she could possibly be required or allowed to give a man an order. It's not very masculine for men to allow women to serve in the Army with them. So there are all of those sort of preconceived notions that make absolute sense when you are talking about the time that this is being discussed. The model that Marshall wound up suggesting for this women's auxiliary was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was great during the Depression, but was not really going to give you the organization, the hierarchy, the control, or even the kind of woman that you wanted to serve. Because if you're going to have women in or even with the Army, they have to be exceptional women. So, you know, it's not like Becky Joe, who works down at the Dairy Queen, is going to be the choice of the Army. The enlistment standards ultimately for women are significantly higher. You're expected to be better educated. You're expected to have a more social grace. You're expected to have a good reputation in your community. The women are, in fact, ultimately interviewed by a committee that is created in each of the 9 core areas in the United States. And the committees are composed of a general and then 2 or 3 women of status who interview the women who are interested in joining the service, especially that first group. Now, once you have your first group and you have officers who are commissioned, then you can change the process a little bit. But there is essentially an enlistment board that women have to go through that men volunteering do not have to, because they aren't really concerned whether the young men who are volunteering go to church on Sunday. But these sorts of things are a real concern for the Army when it comes to the women who are going to enlist. But anyway, this plan that Marshall requests, that actually lays dormant for 18 months. Now, he recognizes we're going to need it, but he's not in any real hurry, and he doesn't want to do anything with it until he has to. And then there comes a point where, in fact, he does have to, because Edith Nourse Rogers, who is in the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, she's a Republican. She won her seat when her husband died in 1925. And Rogers is intensely interested in 2 things: veterans in the military and women. Now, veterans in the military, they rank first. There's no doubt about that. But she had done some volunteer work during World War I, and she was very aware of just how important that work was, that the women who had done that work, how hard they had worked and how important it was. And she was very unhappy that they did not have those benefits as veterans. She is instrumental in much of the legislation that has to do with the military up until she died in 1960. You may know her as one of the primary sponsors of the GI Bill, but she is also important in the 1942 legislation that created the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the 1943 legislation that turned the WAAC into the WAC, both of them called WAC, but one has one less A. After the war, she is intensely involved with the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in the 50s, shortly before she died, she was an outspoken opponent of American involvement in Vietnam. So she remained dedicated to military concerns throughout her career. But in 1941, getting back to our particular part of the story, in 1941, she went to Marshall and she said, I'm going to introduce legislation. And my good friend Eleanor Roosevelt kind of likes the idea herself. And my bill says that women should be in rather than with the Army. But she was nice, you know, she just wanted to let Marshall know it was coming. She didn't want to blindside him. So Marshall quickly unburied that, that plan that had been created previously and spruced it up a little bit so that it would meet some of the requirements of Rogers and of Eleanor Roosevelt without, of course, allowing women to be in the Army. Now, Nourse, Rogers says, okay, fine, I will sponsor this bill. It's not what I want, but she's a realist. She knows what she can likely get through Congress. It's got the support of the War Department, and the Senate is largely amenable to this particular wording. Where she really winds up having trouble is in her own House of Representatives. And you get a lot of pushback in the House. They drag their feet, they set it aside, they want to amend it. They do everything they can to delay this bill as long as possible. And it's not altogether clear to me what they thought they were gaining by doing this, because it was a fairly weak bill. I mean, women were not in the service. The closest I can come, and again, we are talking about a period of time where this makes absolute sense, but the closest I can come is this particular concern. This is opposition again in the House of Representatives. Who then will do the mending? This is real. This is a congressman standing in the House and saying, who's going to do the mending? If they're going to be in the Army, then clearly we will have to sew on our own buttons. And this is one of the more amusing, but many of the comments are of the same vein. There's real concern about what this is going to do to the relations between the sexes. And this is mild, really. They're just worried about who's going to wash the dishes. There were objections because they were convinced that women who served in uniform would no longer be fit mothers. In fact, there were some who honestly believed that if a woman served in uniform, she would lose her ability to conceive. That somehow this would so masculinize, is that a word? But so make her so masculine that she would simply not be able to conceive. There was also concern, of course, that any woman who would want to do this was not morally upstanding. There was a real worry about a woman's sexual behavior and her sexuality if she were to enlist. What would that mean about her, or what would it do to her? So, and these are real concerns. They sound pretty silly to us now, and I guess they should accept that those concerns still actually exist out there. There are still worries about that. I teach majors, a lot of them are women, and they will tell me that when they told their families that they're going to join the Army, that they get responses that vary from, well, don't you want to have children, to, oh my gosh, you've always been so feminine. We didn't realize you were one of those. And of course, sometimes protective relatives will say, are you sure you want to do that? Because you know about the level of sexual assault that the military is experiencing. So those concerns still exist. I have not yet had a student say to me, well, my mom was worried that I would not be able to have children if I put on this uniform. But I can't say for sure that that particular concern doesn't exist. But again, I think this is very indicative that there is a real concern about what this is going to mean about the relations between the sexes. Ultimately, the bill establishing the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was signed into law on 14 May in 1942. It had been introduced in early 1941. So it had taken about 15 or 16 months to make its way through both houses. The first director of the WWII was Ovada Culbert. You see her up there in the top corner. She is a very attractive woman. She is, in fact, something of a socialite from Texas. She is an incredibly well-educated woman. She's a businesswoman. She has a law degree. She is a newspaper publisher and editor. She's a wife of a former Texas governor. She has 2 children. She is not the run-of-the-mill woman. And that's exactly the sort of woman they need to be directors of these new women's organizations. They are looking for women who are accustomed to leading. They're looking for women who get how bureaucracies work. And they're looking for women who cannot be accused of having a less than stellar reputation or background. So these things are very important. Now, she had been chief of the Women's Interest section in the Public Relations Bureau of the War Department for some while. And when it became clear that this original WWII bill was going to pass, they started asking for suggestions for who should be the first woman director. And they asked her as well, who should be the first woman director. She had a very short list of just 2 or 3 names. She did not include herself on it. But there were a variety of people, including Marshall, who also were asked to submit names. And her name was at the top of every list save her own. She seemed a natural choice. She was already familiar with the way the Army bureaucracy worked. She was already familiar with a number of the bureau chiefs. She already had a good working relationship with Marshall. She had at one time actually direct access to Marshall, but for a variety of reasons, not in any way an insult to her, that was taken away. But she still could do an end run if she needed to. But again, she was savvy enough to know that, yeah, sometimes I'm going to have to do that, but I'm really going to save that for the big deal. I go to Marshall only when I'm in a corner and when something is so important that I really do have to have him, make it happen. So she was very, very good at what she did. So women heard that the auxiliary is open. They were very excited about serving the country for, again, the same reasons that most men were excited about serving the country. The United States needed that manpower. Even in 1942, it was already very clear that we were not going to have enough men to fill all of those administrative, mechanic positions and still fill combat units. So it was becoming very apparent that we needed to have women in uniform as quickly as possible. But again, remember, they are enlisting, they are signing up for the Auxiliary Corps. They don't have military status, although this time it is administered by the Army. The curious thing about this lack of military status, and that probably 99.9% of the women who enlisted in the WWII didn't know, is that if they didn't like it, or they got bored, or mom needed help, they could just leave. They would not be deserters. They could just walk away. Now, if they had known that, you have to wonder what would happen. You know, the Army didn't go out of its way to publicize that, nor did Colonel Hobby. But that was one of those loopholes that you can only close in one way. And that way, of course, is to make it part of the Army. Without military status, Williams Army Auxiliary Corps members who were sent overseas still lacked the legal protections that soldiers in World War II lacked. They didn't have the same benefits. They didn't have the same rank as male soldiers, and oh, by the way, they weren't paid as well. They were actually, and I won't go into the details, but the rank system doesn't even sound like a military rank system. They were first, second, and third soldiers. Their pay was nowhere equal, even for officers. And those became real recruiting problems. Especially after the other services, the sea services, began recruiting, because those women were recruited into the WWIIs and into the Women Marines, WMs, on military status. So by 1943, the WWII, the Auxiliary Corps, faced a personnel crisis that forced Congress to revisit that 1942 legislation. And in 1943, they passed legislation creating now the WWII with 1A. That provided women in the Army the same protections and benefits enjoyed by women in the other services. That bill was passed in July of 1943. During the following 90 days, women in the Auxiliary Corps had the option of joining the WWII, the new WWII, or leaving the service. So you had to actually make a decision. I'm going to join to be part of the Army, or I'm going to leave. Now, while the Army was enduring all of these growing pains, the Navy was sitting back and learning. And in fact, it had done something like that in World War I. Had sort of just kind of sat back, waited to see how the Army got it wrong, and said, well, that's what we don't want to do. So they did something similar in World War II. The lead for how to incorporate women into the Navy in World War II was the Bureau of Aeronautics. That was spurred on, too, by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which, of course, increased pressure from Congresswoman Rogers. And then, of course, the Navy and the Marines are looking at really brutal losses in the Pacific during this period. and it is becoming increasingly clear that they really do have to free every male Marine they possibly can to fight. And, the Marines were not thrilled with doing it. But when they did it, they said, every Marine is a Marine. We're not going to have cute acronyms. We're not going to have any WACs. We're not going to have any waves. We're going to have women Marines. Now, there are invariably nicknames that Marines come up with for the women serving. Some of you are probably familiar with things like BAM, Broad-Ass Marine. But that's pretty standard. But as far as the Marine Corps was concerned, they were women Marines. And that was never up for discussion. The legislation that was required to let those women join the sea services as part of the service itself passed Congress much more easily than the legislation that had been put up for the Army. Part of that probably had to do with the sea services being more open to the idea than the Army had been. Nevertheless, there was still argument about it, this time rather than in the House, in the Senate. So none of it can you put together with any kind of pattern, except that there is always some sort of concern and resistance to it. Ultimately, Eleanor Roosevelt interceded in this particular case just to get it moving along more quickly. And Public Law 689 was enacted on 30 July in 1942 that established the women's components for the sea services. Now, WAVES, that was an acronym that was chosen, and then they fit the words into the acronym, because they had to have something that was appropriate to the sea services, and so that's what they opted for. And it turned out as Women Accepted for Volunteer Service, which doesn't say anything about the Navy, but again, it fit the acronym. Mildred McAfee, the woman in the center, was the first WAVE director. The same law provided for, again, women Marines, and the first director for the women Marines was Colonel Ruth Cheney Streeter. Now, all of the services met certain problems when it came to recruiting, to housing, to creating uniforms that would fit women. It was men who were in charge of these things, many of them resistant to women being in the service, but most of them just resistant to trying to find pretty fabric when the fabric they had for things like uniforms was really quite serviceable, and they did not need the extra burden of requisitioning new fabrics or new uniforms. So some of the objections are very practical and I think make perfect sense in a time of crisis. Let's keep this as simple as we possibly can. But some of it is in a little way, in some ways, still just a little spiteful. For instance, WAVES were originally not allowed to wear gold braid. They wore a light blue braid on their uniform sleeves. That, they weren't men, they weren't permanent, they were girls. Light blue worked well. So there, Sarah, there's some of this stuff that even now, even keeping in keeping in mind when this was happening, seemed, probably like more work than maybe it could have been. But this is better. The blue with the light blue is much better because the original uniform that had been proposed by some designer contracted by one of the males was some sort of gaudy red, white, and blue contraption. And the director and everyone she could get on her side balked at that and finally had her way and got something that did not look like a circus uniform. And if I recall correctly, that's one of the descriptions that she had for it. Recruiting was a problem for a few reasons. Some of it had to do with, again, those higher standards. And the idea that you would only need a certain number of women. So, for instance, the Army. Well, we're going to need about 12,000 women. 3 times as many applied for those slots. And then it turned out that they needed at least 25,000. And then that number grew from there. Well, no, we actually need these many thousands. And they wanted women who were educated. They wanted women who came from a good social background, originally thinking that what they were going to have was, women sort of serving as secretaries in those traditional the first face you see when you come in the door as a secretary, a receptionist, something like that. But then it became increasingly clear that they were going to have women doing things like working on tanks and trucks and airplanes. They were going to have women working in mess halls and working as laundresses. So how do you say we only want the very finest so that we can put you in the laundry? So that posed some issues. And again, when you could join the Navy or the Marines, and even though you were doing some of the similar things, they're not the Army. It doesn't work quite the same. The jobs really are different, particularly in something like the Navy, where there were a lot of opportunities for women to be involved with more scientific and technical jobs. Most of you have probably heard of Admiral Grace Hopper. Well, she is a mathematician. She was on the ground floor of some of the most important computer science breakthroughs, and she was in the Navy. They recognized her talent, and they put her where she could do the most good. So there are, as in every service, even now, those of you who have children or grandchildren who have considered it, they're looking at all the services to see what the options are. So, those choices are as real for women in World War II as they are for people who are enlisting now. Ultimately, the Army moved its enlistment goal to 63,000 women. They discussed for a while of well over 1 million, but they realized that they weren't going to get that number. But again, those enlistment goals rose and rose. The Navy also did something smarter, something else smarter than the Army did. The Army sort of relied on the system it already had in place in terms of training and organizing a women's corps. The Navy turned to women's colleges. Who best to know how to organize, educate, and train a large group of women? Who best to have the right facility? You know, if you need quarters in short order that will work for training, say, your first class of naval officers, then a women's college is a very likely place to look. They also had an advisory council that was comprised of largely college administrators. And that council had direct access to the Bureau personnel that helped. So between the two of them, the Bureau personnel and this advisory council, that helped guide the Navy in recruitment and training. And again, Mildred McAfee, president of Wellesley, was chosen as the first director of the WWII. Moreover, the WWII said, you know, this waffling that the Army has done on how many people it really needs to take in, let's see if we can't sit down and get a really good idea of how many we need. And the Navy set a very firm recruiting goal of 87,000 and stuck largely to that. The Marine Corps did not recruit women until February of 1943. Realized they needed to do it, but they wanted to get it right, and they still weren't too excited about the idea of a woman Marine. But nevertheless, they began recruiting for women Marines. At this time, only a reserve. They're not regular. Ruth Cheney Streeter, who had a history in public service. She had her own pilot's license. She had been involved with the Civil Air Patrol. She'd been on the Army and Navy Committee for New Jersey. And again, she was well educated. So she fit the picture that the Marines wanted, again, of a women's director. There were still problems, of course. It didn't all go smoothly. You think you're going to handle the women's corps in the same way that you're going to handle the men's corps, and it just doesn't work that way, despite your best intentions, despite even despite willingness. But those officers are already overburdened because of the rapid wartime expansion taking in male soldiers. And if a man was given a choice, even if he thought that he needed to get the work done for the women's components, if he's given a choice between getting the paperwork through for what we would now call a war fighter and getting the paperwork through for a male clerk, the war fighter is going to get most immediate attention. It was hard for the directors to fight that system because they are civilians. Hobby probably had the easiest time of it simply because she had been around for a while and was a little bit better connected than the other two directors. But they were also directors, and that gave them no command authority. So they are restricted in that way as well. So you really had to work this as a diplomat. And that probably is another good reason to have someone like a women's college president or Hobby, who is a governor's wife and a lawyer in her own right. A woman like Streeter, who is well educated and can at least stand toe-to-toe with some of those men saying, hey, look, you know, I've got my own pilot's license. You know, I'm not a seamstress. And there is strength in numbers. In many instances, the directors cooperated with each other so that they could present a united face and saying, look, you know, this isn't just me. This is not my hobby horse. This is something that we understand needs to be done, and you need to give this consideration. They were all experienced with that administrative diplomacy, how to get those things finished. how to get those things taken care of. And in fact, until the 1970s, what you had for the women's components were directors. And although they really didn't have that command, that decision-making authority, there were very few decisions made regarding women's components without the unanimous support from the various directors. So the positions are very important, but they do not, up through the 70s, have any kind of command authority. That is in keeping with the fact that women are not in combat. If you're not going to be in a combat arm, if there's not any likelihood that you will be exposed to combat, then you simply don't need command authority. So a lot of these things that we look back at sometimes now with frustrations, again, they made perfect sense at the time. Those things have changed slowly over time. You are all probably familiar with the decision to eliminate the combat restriction on women made in January of this year. It'll be fully implemented in January of 2016 so that all combat arms are now open to women who can do it. And the success that these women had in World War II helped, in fact, to convince the United States that it needed to have women in the service even during peacetime. There was a great deal of popular support for that between right after World War II ended, which is surprising when you stop and think how quickly we wanted to demobilize the Army. We nevertheless did believe that women should have a permanent place in the military. Still nothing like men held, but that they should have a permanent place. And there was a good deal of lobbying for that. Curiously, the directors did not support that. They did not lobby for that. In fact, some of them spoke out against it. But nevertheless, in 1948, the Women's Integration into the Service Act was passed and Harry Truman signed it, giving women a permanent place in the United States military. This is a response, actually, to crisis. And that's what you see here. We think of frequently, we just think it's peculiar. Some people can't quite make the connection about why decisions are made about women in the service when they are. But that first real decision about whether or not to make women part of the military happens in World War II, which is as close to total war as we ever want to get. This is a time of real crisis, and they realize they cannot do without the aid of women. That gets them thinking. And it's very, very quickly after World War II ends, and even though we do it reluctantly, we recognize that the world is now a much different place, and that the Soviets probably really aren't our friends, and that there is a possibility of war at any time, and that we are going to have to think about manpower needs. So there's a continuing crisis, and women are included then as a permanent part of the military. You see this again after the Vietnam War, because it has become very clear to the United States at that point that in times of crisis, we cannot rely on a draft. That will not happen again. The American people won't stand for it. So we turn to an all-volunteer force, but in order to get enough volunteers, you're going to have to make more room for women. And I would contend that the end of the combat restriction on women is another indication of that. That if, in fact, Our enemy is now global and is going to be out there at all times, and we have to be ready to act under any circumstances. If that's what you anticipate we face, then you have to be ready to fight with whatever you have. And when you stop and consider that women make up 15% of the current armed forces, then you can't really afford to keep them out of those combat arms as well. So what you're watching, I think, and this is an important piece that we don't always put there, is that you're watching a trajectory. As there are more and more crises, the United States starts looking to how best to meet that crisis. And it doesn't matter what your weapons look like if you don't have the people to arm them, or even if you've got enough people to use the weapons, someone has to take care of logistics and admin. So we wind up including more and more of our citizenry. That brings up other questions about citizenship, which we don't have time to deal with here, but I think that then leads to that much bigger question. So I hope you've learned something today that you didn't know, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
You said that our citizens wouldn't go along with another draft.
Right.
And so why do we have the men now having to register when they get to be 18, which goes to age 26?
Well, that's a safeguard, and that's the best that they could do. But keep in mind that we have not used that we have continued to rely on that all-volunteer force, on people saying, yes, I choose to do this. And part of the reason that there hasn't been the use of selective service is because no one believes that we could get away with it. Now, there is talk, very, very quiet talk, of including women in registration. So the question is, are we going to leave it the way it is? Are we going to make women register? Are we going to do away with it altogether? And I have no idea where that will go. I mean, we can't have a budget, so how can we possibly deal with this issue?
I was curious what the status of the women in the Nurse Corps were at the opening of World War II when the Philippines fell, and we had nurses who were imprisoned, who were prisoners of the Japanese, behind enemy lines.
The Nurse Corps had been established in 1901, I think, after the Spanish-American War. So they had a different status, but it was certainly better than the volunteers had during World War I. So are they the same? Yeah, but different. I'm sorry. There are also questions over here if you get a chance.
Could you speak briefly to the status and experiences of the women's armed service pilots in World War II?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The women's armed service pilots, the women that flew the aircraft.
Yes.
The WASPs.
Right. Yeah. What about them?
Their status and so forth.
Dr. Curatola?
They, just like Dr. Valentine said, they don't have a military status. They can fly ferry airplanes around the United States, taking airplanes from the factory and delivering to the Army Air Corps fields. So men can train on these things, but as far as their status goes, yes, they are not military members. They don't raid any kind of benefit as a result of their service, and it isn't until, I believe it's the 1970s or 80s, that they are finally recognized by the federal government for their service as contributing to the victory in the Second World War. But largely they're used for ferrying service and in training commands during the stateside operations.
He's our air power guy.
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the sexual harassment situation.
I work for the Army, and I in no way am speaking for the Army at this point. I'm hugely frustrated by it. I teach a course on women at war, and my preference would be to teach that as a history course. I'm a historian. I don't get to do that because that's not necessarily what's on the mind of my students in that class. And it's not just women who take that class. That class is almost always split about half and half, female and male. And they are all intensely interested in this problem and what to do about it. Frequently, you will hear someone respond, well, it's no worse in the military than it is in the public or on universities. Well, that may be so, but so what? The Army needs to take care of itself, universities need to take care of themselves, and the American public needs to take care of that issue as well. And there is the larger concern, of course, that soldiers shouldn't be raping soldiers. I mean, they're supposed to be comrades in arms. So there are those issues. The other thing, of course, and I won't go into this, but my experience with the sexual assault and rape prevention training is abysmal. It makes, in many ways, it's supposed to be very serious, and it is really superficial and taking it quite lightly. Now, having said that, I read an article just a couple of days ago that was saying the Navy had implemented a program starting with training at the Great Lakes Training in Recruit Training Center, where they start from when the time that the recruits are on the bus going to the training center, they start the training. This is your comrade. You treat them with respect. You don't assault them under any circumstances, no matter what. And they seem to have been having a very good result with that. So, having complained about the prevention training, I do think there is a real effort to try to figure out how to address this problem. What you can't do, as I think it was an Air Force officer said recently, is, well, you know, it has something to do with this hookup culture these young women grow up in. Blame the victim. Except that now, of course, we know that more and more men are coming forward and saying, I've also been assaulted by my comrades. So this really is a big issue. This is a big deal, and I am glad that I can stand here and complain about it rather than trying to figure out how to fix it, because this is huge. This is a problem, not a new one. It's not a new problem. It's been there from the beginning, but nevertheless, it's time that they do something about it. So again, I was not speaking for the Army. Back here.
At the time these women entered the 3 military services, did the military services offer them any training, education, particularly along the professional lines? That's the first question. And secondly, were they eligible for the GI Bill after the war?
You know, that's a good question about the GI Bill, and I don't know. Does anybody know the answer to that? I would guess that since they were veterans, that they would be, but to be honest, I just don't know, and it's not anything I've ever seen addressed directly, nor was I clever enough to think to ask it, but I certainly can find the answer to it. Training in terms of like technical training or? Professional training. Oh yeah, absolutely. There were all sorts. There was, training in technical skills, because if you could take a man, put a rifle in his hand, and put him in a combat unit, and give that woman responsibility for working in military intelligence, code breaking. Oh, yeah, absolutely. They tried to match them up. If you're a mathematician or something, well, maybe code breaking would be the right place for you. But as always, that doesn't work out. Sometimes it's like, what do you know? I don't know anything. Oh, well, now you do. So, but yeah, absolutely. Because there's no way that you can match directly skill sets that you bring in from whatever you do directly to a military requirement. Yep.
This is more of a comment than it is a question. I do think the sexual revolution affected the military. I never saw this when I was in the service. And I was exposed to a lot of men of higher rank, what have you, but I do think that has made an effect.
Possibly, except that if you look at there's a book called Victory Girls, Khaki Wackies, and Patriotoots. And it's written by, I can't remember her first name, her last name is Hegarty, Hegarty. The problems with sexual harassment and sexual assault they've been there as long as there have been, bullies and people who can be bullied. I mean, that's what it really comes down to. Well, and the amount, we don't really know because it's not, it's something that only relatively recently, historically, has tried to be quantified. There's another book I can recommend, but, there's only so many books you can read and only so many you can remember.
My favorite Bill Malden cartoon is Willie and Joe are in the foxhole.
Uh-huh.
And Willie turns to Joe and says, "Why wasn't you born a beautiful woman?" And who knew their fantasy would come true?
Well, and that's true. That's true.
There was an article, one of the columnists recently wrote about a retired general, and I forgot what his name was, Mac Chesney or something, and he is suggesting that we have a national service after you get out of high school or college. And you can go to, to see what the various services are like, and then if you like it, then you can perhaps join it. But he was making the point that only 1% serve in the military, and he would like for people to be able to say, well, where did you serve? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And have you heard anything about that?
I haven't. The idea of, what you're talking about is a version of universal military training.
Like
and
the Israelis have, I think.
Sort of. But, that has been an idea that has been suggested periodically across American history. And because we have a very strong suspicion of the military, even when we most love it, like right now, it has never gotten very far. And in fact, the article that you just mentioned, I hadn't heard of until you mentioned it, which doesn't mean anything. I don't read every article that's out there. But it strikes me as another version of that UMT idea.
And it included both men and women.
Well, I think now you would certainly have to do that. Yeah, no question. All right, thank you very much. Before you...
Dr. Valentine, for a great provocative presentation, I would invite you to your attention to the first